Well, trade wars are good, apparently. That's according to none other than US President Donald Trump, who seems keen to start his own. Overnight, he stepped up the rhetoric and is now threatening to add extra taxes on imported cars from Europe. This follows news that he's preparing to impose a 25% tariff on imports of steel and a 10% tariff on imports of aluminium. Now, the US buys steel from more than 100 countries and brings in 4 times more steel from abroad than it exports. But where does that leave the UK? Or come to that, our special relationship? The industry here, of course, has only just begun to emerge from a crisis that saw the loss of some 7,000 steel jobs over the last few years. Labour MP Stephen Kinnock represents Aberavon, which is the home of Port Talbot Steelworks, of course. Good morning.
Good morning, Vaughan.
How important a market is America for Tata?
Well, it's very important indeed. For the UK overall, it's about 15% of our exports, and for Tata Steel UK, it's 10%. So it's a very substantial amount of steel. We're talking into the hundreds of millions here, around 250,000 tonnes of steel. So what President Trump has done, it would, of course, be damaging to our economy. But the bizarre thing about what he's doing is he'd be cutting off his own nose to spite his face, because the steel that we export to the US is used in American supply chains right across the US, and for many, many more people that are employed directly in the American steel industry. So he'll actually be damaging his own support base, the so-called Rust Belt, the people that voted for him, with something that might grab the headlines and look like he's taking very sort of macho action, but in fact will backfire severely on him. And he's also doing the job of the Chinese, because, of course, the Chinese steel industry is subsidized to the hilt. About 80% of Chinese steel is publicly owned or state-owned. And that steel will always be cheaper if they're not controlled.
But that's the point, isn't it? You know, I remember when Tata was in trouble, Port Talbot was under threat. You know, there were people saying, we have to do something about this overcapacity. We have to do something about this Chinese dumping. I mean, you can't blame President Trump for doing exactly what you wanted the European Union to do.
Well, the way to do it is through coordinated international action to target the steel that's clearly being dumped by state subsidy, and enabling them to produce the steel at way below what they would even sell it for in the domestic markets. Target that steel, use your anti-dumping expertise, capacity to go in and look at the steel that's being dumped and take that out of the market through the application of severe tariffs on that steel. Don't use a scattergun blanket approach, which in the end will just produce a trade war. I mean, the risk that he also faces now is that the European Union will start putting tariffs on Harley Davidson's and Jack Daniel's whiskey.
Was it a mistake for the European Union to make that threat? Because all it seems to have done is to bring a counter threat. You know, I'll put tariffs on cars from Europe. You know, and then it will escalate again and again and again, won't it?
Well, he has to understand, and the American people have to understand, that there are consequences to their actions. And when you take a blanket approach like this, you do usher in the possibility of a trade war. What I think is also outrageous is that he's used this special clause that the president can use for security reasons, and he's then taking that as a basis for taking action against NATO countries. I mean, we're supposed to be in a global security partnership, and yet he's using this spurious grounds to take action against his so-called allies. I think it really also throws a sharp light on how isolated the UK would be in a post-Brexit world.
I don't want to go too much after that point, because we were discussing it a little bit earlier. I want to go after the point of President Trump with you, though, because it seems that he blindsided most of his administration and blindsided Congress by making this announcement at the end of what was a very, very rough week for his presidency. I mean, that's worrying in other ways, isn't it? That we seem to have a man who is under pressure and almost acting, I wouldn't say on a whim, but on instinct or gut feeling or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's, okay, what usually happens when you've had a bad day at work or a bad week at work? Well, I know what I'll do. I'll start a global trade war. That seems to be his impetuous shoot from the hip approach to everything. And it's deeply worrying because, as you say, Vaughan, today it's on steel. Who knows? It could be on something even more threatening to our security, just because it's an act of misdirection. The old let's throw a dead cat on the table and get everybody to talk about that, rather than the disastrous week of incompetence and scandal that I've had in Washington, D.C.
Right. Maybe
it's deeply worrying.
Maybe he needs a cat to kick at the end of a bad day rather than a dead one to throw on the table. Stephen Kinnock, thank you very much.